Hi all, so this evening I would like to make an exercise with you, which is not gonna be particularly difficult, also because I will be helping myself with the very useful medieval history manual, Introduction to Medieval Europe 300-1500, second edition by Wim Blockmans and Peter Openbrowsers, which is a good manual. I had to read it because it was advised to do so in order to prepare myself to a selection. I didn't finish it, telling the truth. I switched to other books, but I found I found this manual to be nice, and you know, if you ever wanna really be introduced to the Middle Ages from the very start, or at least in order to see a different perspective that I found, for instance, in the way this manual, for instance, presents the same Middle Ages. It's a very useful book, and you can read a lot of interesting stuff in there. I personally wouldn't. I don't like it extremely much as a manual proper. I mean, it was an interesting read, but I disagree with you know, with how it's being organized, considering it's supposed to be a manual. It's a manual that gives a lot of importance to Northern Europe, like Peasants studies. You know, it's which is not bad. You know, Northern Europe is definitely necessary to the knowledge of the Middle Ages, and it couldn't be otherwise in any circumstance. The problem is when you tend to focus too much on that and forget that very often more important phenomena were occurring in maybe in the south, or even in the east at a certain point. And therefore, you know, I think it's a bit, you know, in terms of perspective, maybe it's not that good. But I repeat, it's full of very interesting information. It's very updated. It contains a lot of very recent conclusions about from very recent studies. It's very thought-provoking, very well done for many under many points of view. So I advise it to you. And I remembered about this manual when I wanted to make this video, because I remembered that at the beginning, page 1, indeed, from the introduction. You're projected into this idea of Middle Ages that is introduced with a series of points. I read here 11 points that and the author starts writing, try to imagine a world in which, and then a sort of this list of, you know, of things that obviously where you could find definitely very often in the Middle Ages, and you can, you know, think of being constitutive of the same time. And I thought it was interesting to reason upon them exactly in this perspective, that is, understanding that obviously the Middle Ages never existed as such, but if we really, you know, and therefore out of any form of ideologism and you know, and arrogance, presumption, telling the truth, is there really, you know, can we really find certain elements that were common throughout the whole to the old medieval age as we conceive it, at least about Europe, or even usually Western Europe, because unfortunately we have this form of you know, everything that happened in the West is interesting, then Eastern Europe is forgotten. I realize that, even if I'm a Westerner myself, but this is probably will be the topic on of another video that I will do one day. And so, without any further ado, let's read these points that the manual presents us with when thinking about the Middle Ages, and let's comment them. So, Here it says, first point, population density at its highest level was less than that of present-day Russia without the latter's infrastructure. Well, it's definitely true. I don't know sincerely how to make a comparison at its highest level. Surely there is a study that supports this proportion. Well, yes, we can think of the Middle Ages as medieval Europe, let's say it this way, as a place where demographic density was very low compared to our times. Yet is this really something that belongs to the Middle Ages? I'm not saying the manual is wrong. I don't want to criticize the manual from this point of view. I want to make the point that, you know, certain characteristics of the medieval era are not actually a prerogative of the medieval era. You know, population density was very low well through the ancient times, even in modern age, and it's just from a certain time onwards, usually with industrial society, that, you know, population density starts to grow on average a lot. And we can talk about at the end of the 19th century about mass society, even not just for population density, but that's definitely, you know, also about that. And therefore, yeah, it's true, there were parts of Europe that indeed were, you know, here it says population density at its highest level. I think it talks about Europe overall. Obviously there were regions of Europe that were very densely populated, others were not, mostly for climatic reasons, but not only, because if you look at the early medieval Europe, for instance, you see that there is a very sharp difference between Northern Europe and Southern Europe. At that point you understand that, considering how early medieval society was, the climate difference, at different latitudes really does the difference. It does the difference in agriculture, which was the base of economy at that time. It does difference therefore also in population growth. So obviously, if you compare, the density of population of early medieval Scandinavia, are extremely low, probably some of the lowest in absolute terms in Europe. If you consider the population density of Sicily, you will find that it was obviously very high. But during the Low Middle Ages, things start to change, and they start to change in the sense that the axis is not this longitudinal line that crossed in the old continent, dividing north and south. But there is you notice that there's been a great development of Western Europe, especially over Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe grew a lot too during, at the end of the late Middle Ages, was much more populated than it was in early medieval times. But what you see is that Western Europe in general, so also part of Northern Europe, take England or the British Islands, but even Scandinavia up to a certain point had grown consistently, and you find that the more developed areas were definitely one in the West. Even though, if you take British population was extremely low compared to the population of France or Italy, and I'd say that in this process probably a lot was due to agricultural techniques, because the real passage between this, north, from this moment in which north was underdeveloped and then it starts becoming developed, it occurs during the High Middle Ages, usually from the Carolingian times onwards. It's famous Peasants' thesis about the fact that the Arab invasions basically blocked the Mediterranean and this shifted trade to the north. This has been very highly criticized. It's very controversial in many ways, but it's undoubted that it's from the high medieval times, and with manorial economy and eventually with the with the so-called rebirth of the 11th century, that Northern Europe, especially Northern France, Southern England, certain parts of Germany starts to grow a lot, economically speaking, and they rocket to, to the stars for for those very medieval standards. And you can see, however, that they had been very underdeveloped instead up to certain centuries, a couple of centuries before, which is quite interesting indeed, and that's normally explained, in fact, with the expansion of manorial and eventually feudal economy, that really achieved a better organization of over a great quantity of resources in order to build something much more structural. During the early Middle Ages, instead, you find in those very areas a lot of freemen, very poor freemen, however, that cultivated their own tiny part of land, and that essentially maybe could be sufficient for a family to go on, but it wasn't, it lacked coordination very often with superior stages that could orchestrate a better, and more rational distribution of resources aimed to a certain goal of growth. Obviously, probably there was also a low potential of resources in general, and things changed. We don't know very well. Even the 11th century rebirth in this sense is very debated, because we don't know whether it happened really for the climate change, or because there was simply enough space to grow, or maybe both things. The important though is that that's the moment in both in Northern and Southern Europe where economy starts to grow much from the early medieval times. So definitely the Middle Ages have a low, medieval Europe definitely has a low population density, like many parts of same Europe of the ancient world. In spite of the peaks reached during the Roman times, it was still a very low population density. And even during the modern age, certain areas were not very densely populated in Europe. You can argue not even today in some part. Here, the manual introduces obviously the example of present-day Russia, that is indeed not a very densely populated country. And so that makes an example. So passing to point 2, medical knowledge was appalling, which meant that most people died young and had to live with serious physical suffering. Yeah, definitely true. Definitely true, because indeed medical knowledge was poor in the Middle Ages, like it had been poor in the ancient world. Many people get it as if, the ancient world was a place where, full of doctors that understood. No, false. More or less we're talking about the same medical knowledge. Obviously, there was a shift probably. For instance, the migrating Germanic confederations had brought into Southern and Western Europe certain medical knowledge that they had developed in their conditions in the Barbaricum, that there were problems that in the sedentary Mediterranean worlds were less important. So you find these kind of medical knowledge mingling during the Middle Ages, and yet if you look at, for instance, the Salernitanian School of Medicine of the 12th century in southern Italy, was one of the most developed medical centers of the time, yet it was mainly studying, ancient knowledge, very often from Arab manuscripts, copying, the Greeks or the Greek treatise of medicine most of the times. So we can say that medical knowledge was appalling in the Middle Ages, definitely, and yet that it remained appalling for a very long time. indeed, although maybe some slight progress might have been done overall, but we don't have to be so optimistic. There was no steady progress. People were always capable of, dealing in the measure it was possible, all over the medieval era. This meant that most people died young. Yes, although this is very debated, telling the truth, because as we know, there was a very high birth mortality, so very very high neonatal mortality up to the first years of life. Children were were really at risk. Mostly for illnesses, bad nutrition and stuff like that. Although if you reached your teenage, probably you had some good hopes to make it to at least the 50, 60 or something, or even beyond, which was more rare, but it wasn't probably, I don't know statistically whether if most people actually died young, and it doesn't really tell what young means. Surely, I don't know, in 7th century Scandinavia, people died younger than, I don't know, in 14th century Italy, but it's still something that you should measure, and that most people died young. It's a bit sibling, but at least it gives the idea that surely they died much younger than we do today on average. So that is really what the manual gets it right for us to read, and had to live with serious physical suffering. Yes, it is true. You can see that even, this is something that you can, if you have very old grandparents, you can tell you how life was really, I don't know, 50 years ago, 70 years ago, and how, or before, in fact, and how people were even more, they accepted more pain. They were probably more resigned to such things, even to mortality itself. Think about how, physical suffering from coming from illnesses, injuries, and stuff like that. But you don't think even about moral suffering, what it meant to see so much more death than surely we see today. Not just for illness, but for continuous warfare and all the problems that this implied, even in the mental health of people at the time. So it definitely was a very harsh time. And also here, yeah, but it wasn't that harsher than, the ancient age or the modern age, on average. Probably, certain medieval communities were, probably even more peaceful than, at least considering the number of demographical density in certain cases than others in ancient and modern age. But it's true that, however, during the medieval age, the lack of very strong centralized authorities brought to a lot of more mess, from and there were lots of brigandage, a lot of violence scattered in everyday life. We can say. So point 3, people consequently, referred to the second point, lived under a demographic high-pressure regime, which means that only by maximizing fertility were they able to keep ahead of mortality. Yes, this is true. I don't know how, how rationalized that was. It would be interesting to see that. You can obviously recognize that, yeah, there was probably a society set in that way. People married at a very young age, usually. Wasn't always the case, especially in more developed medieval societies, but the idea was that a lot of children died, so the best you could do was to make many children, because that was the only way eventually you had chances for them to to help you even as a parent in work, and having someone to give to entrust your goods to. And this allowed, obviously, the survivors to be more than people dying. And obviously, these also implied. We think about the idea of natality that was pushed by the church, the idea that still was present up to a few generations ago, that people had to make children continuously. Obviously, there were also very few um, um, very few contraceptives for birth control that at large surely weren't used, or at least if they were used, were very scarce. A very scarce efficacy, effectiveness. Um, 4. There was an abundance of young people. Yes, surely compared to our times, it's definitely true. Today we live in relatively old societies where people are, always less fertile, or better, they make always less children. We come from a moment of boom for which people who were born at that point with a baby boom now are old people. So demographically speaking, there is this unbalancement that is also quite negative for economy. At that time, mortality was high. Yeah, there were probably more people than there are today. Point 5. Infrastructures, roads, bridges, and means of transportation were of poor quality / primitive. So, yes, usually. Obviously, with the decadence of the Roman Empire, the road system, declined and crumbled essentially. So here it says roads, bridges. Normally, yeah, there were very few ones. There were areas of Europe that surely didn't know paved roads until at least the end of the Middle Ages. Because Roman roads indeed were just, in former Roman Europe, and even there was a decline. Surely there were other means of communications elsewhere. As far as I know, into Central Europe there were certain tracks, especially in swampy areas. There were, since even prehistoric times, certain footpaths that were, hired over the Earth's surface to avoid getting into the swamps and managing to pass over dry land. But obviously they were structurally very, very weak compared to paved roads that start being built from the times of the low Middle Ages, structurally and consistently all over, especially Western Europe. And this meant obviously that all the consequences it was much more difficult to travel than in other ages. But also here we don't have to think that it was such terrible moment compared to other eras. Take the modern age, or think, I don't know, when America was conquered by the Europeans. There weren't roads there, at least there were very few. So the same situations were presented once again in certain contexts. I mean, the absence of a road system. And even during the ancient times, the word the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans who built roads, most famously the Romans, also because they had the largest empire. But yeah, Roman roads were built all over Europe and they were very important, but it's not that they passed literally everywhere, even in the same Roman Europe. So you still found certain areas of the empire that, had, you know, difficulties in keeping the communication steady. Especially during the late Roman Empire, there were certain areas within the same imperial borders that were, declining, and where, the infrastructures were falling apart, and therefore, and also before obviously the Roman conquest, there were certain roads. Indeed, think about the Celtic roads of the Iron Age, but they were quite primitive in many ways, in spite of what many people like to tell. And there were certain areas where there weren't roads at all. There were just footpaths or something like that. Here we go instead to number 6. This is connected with the previous point. Few people ever traveled far, hence geographical scope and the mental outlook of most people were narrow. Yes, this is true. It's very beautiful. As medievalists, we like to challenge the stereotype that medieval people were, so narrow-minded, and they knew a few about our places. But this, who wrote this sentence is right, because most people were narrow indeed. Many people who really traveled a lot and very far during the Middle Ages, who saw a lot, who read a lot, but they definitely were a minority of the population. During the low Middle Ages, you can find something better overall, but to our standards, yeah, people were narrow in that time. Although in ways that that would surprise you, not maybe they were narrow in certain ways, but they were still more intelligent than us for other things. So never think to be, more intelligent than a medieval person just because you lived in the 21st century. No. Don't ever fall into this mistake, because intelligence is something very relative in many ways, and let's say that the scopes were narrow most of the times, because they traveled a really few, or at least they traveled at short range usually, and they knew a few places that, as we've seen, were few had few people, and the road system didn't really encourage to take very long journeys. Point 7. Economic production was overwhelmingly agricultural. Yes, it was. And we should stress the adverb overwhelmingly, because it really was, and you have to think about the world up to the Industrial Revolution based on agriculture. Yes, in the modern age you have trade that rockets at a certain point, but they were still largely and overwhelmingly agricultural societies. So this is, for instance, another prerogative that doesn't really fit them. Doesn't really describe only the Middle Ages. It was normality before the Industrial Revolutions, and the two ones, or 3 or 4, as you want to call them, up to today. We go to 8. As a result, from the previous point, most people were peasants who lived in small villages. Yes, this is true. Even where, in the low medieval world, when there were lots of cities, and very densely populated, by the way, the wide majority of people inhabited the countryside and were mostly peasants. Although we should remember, and this is something that is very rarely recalled, that very often people say, during the Roman age, the cities were everything. The Roman age was really, the Roman Empire was an empire based on cities. Yes, although even in the Roman Empire, most people were peasants who lived in small villages, because if you really look at the quantities, the people who lived in cities in Roman times were the vast minority. Hmm? So, did it change so much relatively to medieval age? If you look at all the cities that grew all over Europe up to a certain point, you would change your mind. And this is true, however, for even to up to the contemporary era, people were peasants. Up to the 20th century in Western Europe, most people lived into the countryside. So um, this is not a prerogative of the Middle Ages as well. Point 9. Technological development and mechanization of human labor were very limited. Yes, it's true. Although this doesn't mean that medieval technology and mechanization was lower than the past. Not at all. The Middle Ages were the era of the machines, and they went far beyond the Romans in many ways, especially in architecture. So yeah, here it says technological development at large. Yes, we can say that scientifically speaking, the only substantial innovation during the Middle Ages from ancient times were in optics, which is something you start finding to a certain point. I think since the 13th or 14th century, people started using glasses, using lenses to do certain things, and that's the only field of technology that basically saw, a substantial development from ancient times. Otherwise, the medievals were maybe just only the early Middle Ages, backwards compared to certain parts of the ancient world, and eventually they even surpassed the ancient world, especially during the low and late Middle Ages. Mechanization of human labor was limited. Yes, substantially. You could use, water, water energy, wind energy, and fire energy, but it was a very there was a very few resource energetic potential, let's say, from this. So we have to wait until the scientific revolution in the modern age to see something different and things changing. Point 10. The Christian religion informed practically every aspect of daily life. This is true on average, and it's very important for those societies where this actually happened. However, we must think that for many centuries of the Middle Ages, vast areas of Europe were not Christian yet. So you could argue, that this is true, but to a lesser extent probably of the other points. And however, where Christianization occurred, surely religion informed practically every aspect of daily life. But in here you can make a good relativization, saying that in those times, in whichever place you went, religion informed practically every aspect of daily life. This was typical both of polytheism, from which most of Europeans came from at the beginning of the Middle Ages, and this was true also in Christian life. And then there were substantial, syncresis into this. So let's say that it was the whole world that was conceived in terms for which religion would inform every aspect of daily life, and it was just Christianity, in this sense. Even in terms of monotheism, I don't know, Muslim Spain, probably many people were informed by Islam, and the contrary. So it was really so. However, in the places where Christian religion was spread actually. So 11th and last point. Most people did not have any formal education and were unlikely to be able to read or write. Yes, this is true as well, even though also here we should think that things were very diverse within the same medieval era. First of all, for instance, obviously Northern Europe, basically until the modern age, was much less educated and illiterate than Southern Europe. You know, the higher level of education since the early Middle Ages was very spread, even partly in the countryside, was obviously in Italy. For many reasons that, it wasn't just that Italy was rich, it was also a way, it was organized socially and also politically especially, so that influenced that. 14th century Florence basically surpassed the levels of literacy of Antonine Rome. But it's true that most people didn't have any formal education, and they couldn't write, they couldn't read most of the times, and this was true up to the 2 centuries ago, at least in certain countries, even up to the last century. In Europe, I'm talking, obviously. So this was all. It says then, welcome to the Middle Ages. And the Middle Ages are not just a straightforward part of world history taking place all over the globe. According to long accepted agreement among historians, adopted by standard university curricula and started textbooks all over the world, the Middle Ages are a period in Europe's past that roughly covers the millennium between 500 and 1500. Oh, that's so. Nowadays, the term medieval, with feudal use as a regular alternative, often represents something backward and barbaric, which then is contrasted with more splendid cultures that preceded and followed the Middle Ages. Where did such ideas come from? And this goes obviously into historiography, and so I thank very much the authors of Introduction to Medieval Europe 300-1500, second edition, Wim Blockmans and Peter Hoppenbrouwers. It's very interesting. I enjoyed their manual. I will finish it sometime, and I hope you found this video interesting. Well, it sounds a bit lazy, doesn't it, to read from a manual and commenting, but today I was a bit tired, wanted to do it this way. But I think still it's important to discuss these topics, because you discovered that many people are, and this is very beautiful indeed, and a great satisfaction that many people actually love the Middle Ages and know that it wasn't at all a dark age in any way. But a very few people like to think in technological, scientific terms. I'm not a great expert of history of technology as well. I know something, but just because I realize, in fact, it's important, and repeating a little bit these points in order to make people understand what we are talking about at large when mentioning the Middle Ages. Is very, very useful. So as we've seen, we can argue that most of what seems to be in common to medieval Europe throughout the centuries is something that the Middle Ages actually have with the vast majority of the ancient age, and a very substantial part, at least, of modern age and contemporary age as well. And this means also never forget where we came from. Never give for granted what we have today, because people who lived back in the day were the people who made possible for us to have what we have now. And you can complain saying, yeah, but they were still shitty people, you know, immoral for our standards and violent and all this stuff. Yes, but you're still here because of them. Indirectly, maybe even unwillingly. I don't know how many of us are a product of rape of some kind throughout history. Well, probably all of us. And you know, so yeah, that's dark to think, but it's still important to understand that in order to understand what we have now, and how to make good with what we have now. So I thank you once again for listening. If you like this video, please feel free to share it, or to leave a like, or to subscribe to my channel to receive further contents. And as always, I wish you a nice time, and till the next time, bye.